Hello once again, everyone. Welcome back to our dissection of Codex Wallerstein. So last time we went over the first sword locking out of the Außer-Min. Now we're going to utilize two possible counters to the sword locking. Now an important thing to remember about these two counters is that they can be used in the moment or when there's a slight delay. So just like when we talked about with the Außer-Min, you land and you can then exert pressure without grabbing their sword at all. Or if you want to lock them up, you can take your hand off and then lock them up fully. Or alternatively, from the get-go, from here, you can execute this technique to lock them up initially. These counters can be used both in that moment and after the sword is placed, because that is an important thing to remember, is that when the sword is coming up and through here, while yes, it's absolutely leg against him and sharp thing, not pleasant, that's probably not ragdolling him yet, right? There is that moment where I get to hopefully get my hand between me and that blade and save my life. Now, another important thing to remember is that these two counters are very much worst situation type counters. And soon I'll do a video on hand slices where I'll talk a little bit more about that. But basically, sometimes, especially when you're fighting in a system like this, there are unavoidable positions where you are on the back foot, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're out of the game. And you may have to take a small slice on a less fatal part of your body in order to get out of it. These two counters, I'd say, very much fall into this category of techniques. And so bear it in mind that these would probably not be things that are done without you getting a little bit hurt, right? But your other option is debatably worse. So, with that in mind, let's go back to where we were. Let's actually switch places. So, we're going to switch roles. So what happens is, we're both up, and we provoke the Außer-Min. So he comes down, I fall down onto it with my short edge, which is going to cause him to then push through, and at the same time, he's bringing his hand through, locking me up like this. He's also shoved his arm through, so that now I'm in a really bad spot. I swear it's not COVID. But at this point, if he's got me real and truly locked up, I'm in a pretty bad place. This is the too far gone, right? He's got way more pressure over me. Even if I try to take my left hand off, which is the big part of these two counters, he's got enough wherewithal and power to prevent me from doing anything. So I need to do my action before this completes. So, my first action is going to be to exploit preferably a deeper wrapping of the arm. And this particular play, when you read it on Wichtenauer, it actually, at least to my mind, doesn't seem as terribly linked to the Außer-Min's sword locking as it does just some general advice, because this is some good general advice. The counter I'm going to use is actually one of those kind of universal counters, and it's anytime someone wraps your sword arm, this is available to you. So to break that action down by itself, anytime Randy wraps my sword arm, right, he can wrap it in a couple different places. If he wraps it at the sword itself, you're going to have to let go of your sword if you want to deal with him. But if he wraps anywhere above it, as you can see, my sword is free behind him. Now what's going to happen here is that I'm going to flip the flat up onto his blade, up onto his shoulder rather. Well, it is your blade, it's your shoulder blade. From here I have two options. Because he's wrapped me nice and deeply, I would go for the first option, which is I'm going to grab my own blade, and I'm going to push against his head diagonally over to where my sword is. At the same time I'd step up, and I can drive him down. That's my first option, and that's really one of the better ones, because, sword into face super quick. Also doesn't require a lot of strength, so if you are a smaller person than your opponent, this still works really, really well. Even if they're taller than you, you can ram it up under their chin. So to show that once again, he's wrapped my arm, flop it onto their shoulder, grab and push, and you just step up with them. They can't do a whole lot against it. That's the first option. Second option is I flop it over, but now rather than pushing against him, I'm going to use a little bit of momentum and raise up my shoulder as well. So, he wraps my arm, I flop this over, but now rather than putting it onto his shoulder, I'm bringing it up into my other hand, and from here I'm going to punch forward with the pommel, which forces his head down. Now I'm not actually striking Randy in the back of the head with the pommel. If that happens, great, grand, whatever, right? Technically banned in tournament, but the biggest thing about this is just a universal counter to any overhook, right? He's got an overhook on me, I've got an underhook on him. I need to drive my arm forward to break the structure of his. I'm just doing it with a big lever in my hand at the same time. This one's pretty common, very, very powerful. The only downside of it is, depending upon build, I find it can be kind of unreliable. As a taller person, this one's pretty good for me because I get underneath people pretty quickly. But against bigger people, as I am smaller than them, I find I struggle a little bit getting their shoulder to be manipulated. So sometimes I prefer the former as opposed to the latter, and encourage you to play with both. But anyway, that's essentially what's going to happen here. So back to the play itself. We're up, he cuts from below, I fall onto the sword. Now, as he is coming forward, the priority of his is to get his hand right here, right? This is relatively secondary in this case, because if he doesn't get control of my hands, then he can't shove this through safely. So, just before his sword is coming through, I'm in this moment where I'm kind of wrapped by him. I am going to move to that side. The reason I'm doing this is I'm trying to avoid getting stuck / locked out, because even if he does get his sword here, the best place for me to escape it is to move away from it, right? Buying myself some room. But either way, as this is coming through, I'm going to release with my left hand. I'm going to step up toward his sword, and I'm going to bring my arm between his sword and me. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because my arm is disposable. My face is not. I've only got one of those. I'm going to reach through and grab hold, then I can push him out. And as you see, it locks him up pretty nicely. Now, am I going to get cut doing this? Probably. The images themselves actually show a little bit less. It depends upon the period you're looking at. But in those cases, the images show he's gotten wrapped a little deeper than this move tends to show, which is another reason I think this is partially universal advice, as well as it comes out of this, as opposed to just, this is the counter. But either way, his sword is still here, right? Still a threat, which can also come up in case he just wraps my arm in general and is trying to get me to stop. But either way, I am probably going to get cut a little bit here. But the biggest thing is that what pressure he can exert onto me is relatively minimal in comparison to what pressure I'm exerting onto him. It's a test of who wants to enjoy the suck a little bit more. So to show that once again, we're up here, below, he starts to push through, I move up against him, and in this case, you notice that my crossguard actually got stuck between his hands. That's going to happen a lot, especially if you're using Myers, right, which have particularly long crossguards. It still works relatively similar. Just rather than pushing on his face or going over his shoulder, I put a lot of the pressure more onto the elbow and arm, which shoves him down. But the important thing is getting this up and through while I move to the side. So overall, not a terribly complicated technique. And out of the two counters we're going to cover, I don't actually like this one a whole lot. I like it in its normal form, but I don't like it out of the Ausament. However, it is in there, and with some practice, it's not a bad response to have ready to go. It's just they're going to have to wrap you pretty deeply. So, that's our first counter. Let's talk about our second counter. This one's one I like a little bit more because I had to use it recently. So, in this case, what's going to happen? We're up, so he hits, and now he's actually going to come through most of the way, right? Now, he's locking my arm, and he's getting this across my body. I have a couple options here, obviously, right? But I'm going to once again release with my left hand, but rather than trying to go for my own sword, which in this case, I'm actually caught right now between his chest and his crossguard, I can't really shove this through. He's got really good control of my arm. This one's a little bit better. I'm going to push my arm downward. I'm going to bring up with my other, and I'm actually going to grasp hold of his sword blade near my neck. Now, what this is doing is, number one, it's preventing him from slicing my neck. I may get my palm sliced, but not the end of the world. Two, it's exploiting the fact that swords are levers. And levers, in this case, have two ends, right? If I push on this end, the other end will move. So I'm going to take this, and I'm going to press it across onto his shoulders / neck, right? It's preferable to try and press the flat if you can, just because we're not looking to slice him here, we're looking to just get clearance. So once I get this up and through, I'm pushing down with my other arm, and I'm just going to drive him back. Now the text says that you can use this to cast them onto their back. I can certainly see how you would do that. I'm not going to do that to Randy just because I don't want the swords bouncing unpredictably. But usually in this case, it's just a good way to get out of a lock, and you can work from there, right? Now I had to use this not in its exact form, but recently when I ended up, someone closed in with me, and he was actually left-handed. But his sword was across his body, my sword was here, and we were actually up against the wall over there. So I had to take his sword against him. So this same lesson can be employed in a couple different situations depending upon what's happening. Basically, anytime their sword crosses you like this, and you're compressed, you just grab that blade and push forward. You can get yourself some clearance. It's not the end of the play, but it's some clearance at least. So we'll show that again. We're up here, he cuts below, I push, he's coming in. Grab as soon as I can, push, and as you see in this case, I also got his arm jammed up in the motion as well. That's just icing on the cake, really. So, we'll show that one more time. No problem. And like I said, these two, I think, are less, they're very much, best of a bad situation. And while I have gotten to use their concepts individually, I haven't necessarily gotten to use them out of this specifically. I'm not saying you couldn't, but by and large, most of your initial practice with these are going to be in different situations. But sometimes just having that little ding of realization of, oh, his blade's right there, push, or oh, my arm is wrapped, push/push, right? It can make a big difference. And that's where piecing these plays together, they become, not just I do this move, he does this move, but more I recognize this stimulus, I can do this response. And that's really the big part about taking these sources and making them actually work for you. But either way, those are the two counters to the first sword locking. Again, unofficial name on the sword locking bit. And thank you very much, Randy. I actually forgot to introduce you, but thank you once again. And next week, we get to move into things a little less grapply and a little bit more distancy, which is going to be quite a lot of fun. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and we will go over some other techniques from Wallerstein another time.